I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Emmy winner Catherine Adair, costume designer on the HBO drama Perry Mason. Catherine, first of all, I know what it feels like to be immersed in a project that is an extension of your passion. So I would love to know how it feels for you to realize your passion in something like this show with this beautiful period that you get to work in.
Oh gosh, that's a huge and fantastic question. It's heavenly, it's glorious. I was a huge fan of season one, which I can't claim to have done. But when I got the phone call and discovered they were going to blow the whole world wide open and explore all the different nooks and crannies and class structure of Los Angeles in 1933, I was like, sign me up, because it's an extraordinary piece of American history. And I think that would be true for anyone, but perhaps because I wasn't born in the States, but I now live here. And because I trained as a classical, quote unquote, costume designer, I fell in love with researching and exploring different worlds and different parts of the world and different ways of telling stories. And it doesn't get much richer than Los Angeles in the 1930s. It just doesn't. I mean, you have Hoovervilles and you have oil barons and you have illegal casinos 3 miles off the coast because they're in international waters, and you're still in prohibition, but everybody's drinking. And you've got everybody coming to Los Angeles wanting to be the next movie star. I mean, it's fascinating history. And to be given the gift of telling part of that story over 8 episodes with showrunners saying, Kate, explore all the different pieces of the puzzle, explore the immigrants, explore the Hispanic community, explore the African-American community, was just like having a giant banquet. You know, you're almost overstuffed with more detail than you knew where to put and what to do with. And an amazing team of people in all the departments who shared information and came up with ideas and went to the showrunners and said, did you know this? And did you know that? And so
Wow.
that was a long-winded way of saying, yes, it was amazing.
Because I mean, if I may say, the work on season one was phenomenal, but season 2 is so spectacular and impeccable. And I mean, we have so much to talk about, so let's get right to it. Well, firstly,
Thank you for that.
you took over from Emma Potter as costume designer this season. Is it really challenging to come into a show for season 2 and further develop the show's look?
Yes and no. Emma did a really lovely template, and Tim Van Patten, you know, reinvented the world beautifully. I've taken over a few shows now, and I think you try and put your ego to one side and you say, as a costume designer, how do I tell the story? How do I service the story? And so I sat down with Team Downey and my showrunners and said, where are you wanting to go from here? Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. The wheel was already extremely solid, but we go into more daylight than they did in season 1. We go into different parts of the community than they did in season 1. So how do you pay homage to season 1 and at the same time grow it from there? And I think it's just communication.
Yeah.
At least I hope that's the case. But thank you for saying what you were saying, because if I may, there's so much beautiful work out there, and in such a diverse palette. There's stylized and over the top and tongue in cheek and all of the different ways of telling stories right now. But we wanted to make this as grounded and real as we possibly could. And there's a number of cases where, with the help of my team, who are extraordinary, we literally looked at old photographs and then said, okay, how do we make this next frame as close to that, or as close to imagery and research that we've done, so that if you put the two next to each other, you wouldn't know which was the film, which was our storytelling, and which was a vintage photograph.
That's fascinating to me, because I just feel like the pressure's on. There are people out there who know what they're looking for as fans of this period. So let's talk about some of the examples. Juliet Rylance as Della, you know, I heard she's even wearing undergarments from the time period, so the clothing would sit correctly. And I think like one of your strengths as a designer, because you know, I know some of your other work, is your attention to detail and that authenticity. So we're entering a portal in time, right? And rather than be drab or austere, which is what I'm expecting from the Depression era, it feels lived in and real, but there's still that panache and style and flair that I just found so breathtaking. So that's a huge achievement, balancing aesthetic and utility. So talk me through that.
Whoa, your questions are amazing. I'm going to steal you and do a masterclass with one of the universities. Juliet's a wonderful actress to work with. In fact, my whole cast on this show, I've been very blessed with a number of my projects with extraordinary actors who really do think through, it's not their vanity as people. It's their vanity and their passion for that character. And so I think it's a collaboration. It's where this is real and then this is real, but how do we keep this tangible and relatable and understandable to a modern audience? And a lot of the photography that you see, especially the portrait, everybody's done to the nines. They're very dressed up. So if you really start to dig into it, archives, yes, women generally wore gloves to preserve their hands, and because it was done the same way that guys used to wear suits to work. But it doesn't mean to say they have to always be wearing gloves. And women wore hats because it was the same way that guys in LA wear baseball caps, but doesn't mean that they absolutely every single minute have to wear a hat. If it's not right for that particular moment in time, then you take the hat off. So it's always working that balance, I think, between the rules and where the rules don't apply. And I think that's true today. And there are so many parallels between the world we're living in today and the discrepancies between wealth and poverty and people living on the streets and the times in the 1930s. So I think that's also a very interesting bridge to explore.
Yeah, what you're saying I think is so important. I hear from quite a few costume designers that the actors have to be comfortable and fit into the costume like they've always worn those clothes. Like, it's important, isn't it, as a designer to achieve that authenticity so that their clothes, rather than the inevitable artifice of costumes, which is what you're making, but we need to kind of transcend that, don't we?
Well, yes, we do. And I've early in my career, I was assisting another designer on a film. Very early in my career, I was still doing mostly theater and got pulled in unexpectedly to help this wonderful designer. And I remember so clearly, she went through about 10 costume fittings on her lead actress. And every single one of those choices that she came up with was phenomenal. But it was only when the actor actually took a look at themselves in the mirror and took a deep breath, and just their whole physicality changed. And suddenly they could see themselves and they could see the character within themselves in the costume. And suddenly the costume wasn't costume anymore, to your point, it was clothing. And they were the character and they were wearing the clothes weren't wearing them. And I think the big thing with Perry Mason, especially as a story, because I think the story is just as valid today as it was back then, the illusion of justice. I wanted you to go into every single frame and live there. And if you've enjoyed it and you've enjoyed the detail, thank you. But that wasn't my primary concern. My primary concern was you believing that you were back in that time, that you were a fly on the wall in those rooms, in those Hoovervilles, in those casinos. And I think that's true for my cinematographers, both my cinematographers and my production designer and the art department as well.
Yeah, it's so true. It is like a portal in time, and it felt to me like I was living through it. And that's not easy to do in period, because it can look very, and not in a bad way, it can just look very artificial, because that's inevitably what you're doing. But yes, I love, let's talk about some of the examples. I love the men's clothing, not selfishly. In this genre and era, the tailoring, the layering, the utility, the sartorial flair, beautiful work. And then I noticed in Paul Drake's neighborhood, you went with a completely new palette of bottle green, canary yellows, vibrant and not as austere as some of the wealthier, I suppose, men of that era. Talk me through that intentional choice.
I think that our communities of color often, even today, have a much, well, it's actually, let me backtrack if I may. It started with a conversation I had with Chris, who's wonderful, and we have mutual friends. So that was a lovely starting point. And he also has a rich history as a theater actor. And that's where I started. So we had a good grounding to start with. In many instances, I think internationally, not just in America, the quote unquote minority communities or the less advantaged communities, they're much more conscious. Well, there's two pieces to it. They're much more conscious of how they present themselves, because it's an added protection. It's an added layer of safety. It's an added layer of armor. It's also, we may not have what you have, but it doesn't mean we don't know how to present ourselves. And it doesn't mean we don't have style. It doesn't mean to say we don't have grace. It doesn't mean we don't have dignity. And I think it's an easy pitfall for any of us to fall into, to presume that if somebody is not as fortunate, or they don't have the same resources, that they are then by necessity less. And in the research I did, this is a community that has respect for themselves, have dignity for themselves, and have style. And so why wouldn't you celebrate that? I don't think people realize that the African-American community here in Los Angeles, there was a very affluent, and I think we do show that in the season, there was a very affluent middle class, upper middle class African-American community, as there was in a number of different cities around America, until other folk came in, upset by how well they were doing, and basically demolished their communities and their affluence and their ways of being. So with Chris's character especially, all he has left is his pride. All he has left is his dignity and his integrity. And I think even if you don't have a very big closet and you don't have very many pieces of clothing, doesn't mean to say you have to go around looking like shit.
Exactly.
It's just sort of that simple. So Chris and I worked together very carefully. Everybody would have a good church suit. Everybody would have a good Sunday best. And if you were having a birthday party in your brother-in-law's house, and you're living in your brother-in-law's house on the floor in his front room, it doesn't mean to say you have to go to Seed. So it was very important to me with all of our communities, and with all of our different neighborhoods. When you go into the Hooverville, they're not all threadbare. A lot of them are. But again, when we were doing the research, some people had just been kicked out recently, like the Gallardos, who'd been moved.
That's right. And they're still clinging on to.
Yes.
Yes. And you can see that through costume.
Yes.
People don't realize that costume's about character and state of mind. And yes. 100%.
I mean, if you go through an underpass in Los Angeles today, not everybody is completely threadbare.
Yeah.
They're just not. And if you go to some of the encampments that sadly we have around, it's the same thing. So why would we do that just because it was 1930s?
Yeah, that would be too easy and too, it's just, we've seen that before. Let's move on. We're running out of time. I was also thinking about how Perry is always really messy, unkept, unironed. I love those choices. They're subtle, but I noticed them. The tie's always too short. The collar's always out. What's that all about, those choices?
Some of that I inherited from season 1, because his character is such a mess, and work threading the needle with Matthew on where he was a little more together and where he wasn't. And again, not drawing attention to his clothes, but also acknowledging that Della, they kept talking about wanting to put a piece in where Della actually takes him to the tailor and says, you've got to have a suit. And we kept laughing about it. It never actually happened, but making sure that he had a little bit more of a cupboard, a little bit more of a closet, but again, it doesn't draw attention to itself because the performance and the story need to come first.
Absolutely. Then you get opportunities like Wealthy Socialite Camilla Nygaard, played by Hope Davis beautifully, and of course Della and Anita St. Pierre, played by Jen Tulloch. So many opportunities for accessories and different fabrics and shades. What was the highlight for you in working with that particular palette?
All of it. Every single piece of it. We built, I think, I should say I had an amazing team, and every single extra was handpicked and hand dressed. And if they brought somebody in who, I know I'm digressing slightly, but anyone who came in and said, I'm supposed to be a lawyer, and we looked at them and said, no, they couldn't possibly be a lawyer, but they'd be an amazing accountant. We dressed them as an accountant. So we really worked very, very hard. And my team that backed me up worked really hard, not just with the principals, but also with the background, to make sure that they looked as believable as the research, which I had plastered everywhere. To answer the question you actually gave me, we built over, I think, close to 900 pieces of clothing for season 2. We dressed 13,000 extras, and I built all of Camilla, all of Della, all of Anita, except a couple of her knits, all of Paul, almost all the principal clothes were built, or I found existing fabrics at the time and we washed them and then reconfigured them so that they got integrated into new pieces. Well, the gift with those 3 women's characters is they're also different.
Yeah.
Della's trying to move into a man's world and be a lawyer. And so the suits that I designed and we had made were very much a nod to that. And because my actress is so feminine in her movement and her way of being, we were able to make them quite structured and somewhat austere, if you think about it. Camilla, designing for Hope, send me anywhere in the world for any of these women, because they're such wonderful people to collaborate with. She was able to break any rule she wanted to because of her money. And then Anita she's in the world of movies. And so the rules that apply to everybody else, she can dodge most of those bullets. So playing with her being a little more bohemian, a little bit more of a rule breaker, wearing fabulous evening pants to go out at night. She was able to take more risks. And again, Jen has the physicality and the presence to carry that. And some of the pieces I designed for her, I think for all 3 women, you have to start with who you have. You have to start with who they are, what their frame is, how they move, and then build from there.
It's such stunning work, especially I really loved Anita St. Pierre's look, and I didn't expect that at all. Catherine, thank you for your time. So that was really insightful, and congratulations on some fantastic work in Perry Mason.
Well, thank you so much for meeting with me. I really appreciate it. And thank you to your podcasts, to everything that you guys do in promoting all of us. I really, we're on our side of the fence at the Costume Designers Guild anyway. We're very grateful. We really are.